I'm going to invite our first speaker up. Sam Safran is a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. In addition to his research on long-term responses of birds to urbanization, he's been working with the Three Rivers Park District staff to analyze how wildlife has responded to restoration work within the parks. Sam.
Okay, yeah. So I'll mostly be talking about Crowhassan Park, and I assume a lot of you are familiar with it, but I'll give some background either way. I'm really happy to present this work. It's been Three Rivers has been monitoring birds for a long time, as I'll show you, and there have been a lot of volunteers who have helped with that. So none of this would be possible without them. I've been working with staff at the Park District to analyze bird monitoring data that they've collected over many decades. And the Park District does a lot of management that we would expect to benefit birds, things like prairie restoration and woodland restoration, wetland restoration. They also do a lot of kind of more fine-scale management like burns and creating nest boxes and things like that. And so we'd expect those to benefit birds, but there's a lot happening outside of the parks that the Park District doesn't have control over. Things like agricultural intensification and urbanization, climate change, and changes to wintering habitat. So the restoration sites at the park seem good. If you go to Crowhassan in the summer and look around, it is quite beautiful. These sites seem really, really nice. But how have the species actually responded? And like I said, there's decades of monitoring data that can help us answer this question. There's a lot of monitoring activities that happen at the park. There's prairie surveys, woodland surveys. We can monitor nest boxes. But what I'll focus on today are these prairie surveys. In case anyone is not familiar or hasn't been, Crowhassan Park, when I checked last night, was a 40-minute drive. Let's see here. We're good? Yeah. It's a holding of the Three Rivers Park District, and it's in the extreme northwest part of the county. The background in prairie restoration at the parks, it started in 1969 with a really small 10-acre prairie restoration where grasses were planted by spreading seed from the back of a pickup. In the 1970s, about 500 acres were added on what was recently abandoned ag land. And then in the 2000s and in 2014, another bunch of prairie was added. So we can kind of see the cumulative amount of prairie growing at the site over time. And this is what it looks like from above. It's a 1,200 acre complex, 850 acres of restored prairie. There's about 170 acres of woodlands that are managed with fire, and then a bunch of wetlands and lakes embedded in that matrix, all kind of nestled within this bend of the Crow River. And so the biological monitoring at the park is really impressive and really extensive. So the purple lines on this map are bird survey transects. There are a handful of points, purple points that are bird point counts. And then other species are monitored with plant surveys, which are the red dots, and the yellow triangles are cover boards. So there's a lot happening. The white numbers are what year each of these units was restored. And so these prairie transects, these core ones that I'm kind of circling here, have been run nearly continuously since 1978 with only 2 observers. So it's a really kind of consistent data set. Larry Gillette surveyed those transects for 33 years, and then Stephen Hogg took over. And then there's many other transects that have kind of shorter time series of monitoring data, but are still really useful. These sites are visited once per year, usually in the late May or mid-June. They're meant to be kind of breeding bird surveys. There have been 301 individual surveys conducted over that time period, with 11 observers helping. Again, it's actually a pretty small number of people who collect most of the data. Almost 80% of it was collected by just 4 observers. So that, again, helps with the consistency and makes this a really valuable data set to analyze. And so there have been almost 7,000 detections of 100 species on these open area surveys in the park. And so I'll be presenting on that what we found with that data in kind of two chunks here. First, I'll talk about community level analyses. So how has species diversity actually changed over time? And are these restorations successful in attracting and supporting grassland birds? And what factors predict the bird community responses to, what factors predict their responses? And then we'll dive into kind of the species level population trends and try to understand those relative to regional trends. I won't talk about the methods in too much detail, but if you're interested in statistical distributions, you can come talk to me. But I'll spare you. So we wanted to filter down to a list of grassland-associated birds to run these analyses. So there's an American conservation database, basically a species database that has lots of trends and habitat associations. So we combine that with the kind of Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas data to get our 218 probable breeding species in Minnesota. 76 of those were listed as having, I keep doing that, I'm sorry, having grasslands as their primary or secondary breeding habitat, of which 58 have regularly occur kind of in the larger, our larger biome region. In this part of Minnesota, and 39 of which have been detected on the Crow-Hassan surveys. This list has things that are really specialist obligate grassland birds. Grasshopper sparrow is here, but it also has a few things that are a little more generalist. I think northern cardinal is on this list. So we're being somewhat permissive when looking at this grassland bird community. Okay, take-home message number one. Each of these lines is a different transect or point count that has been run over time. And when you kind of fit a regression model to this data, we found that species richness in a typical unit in the park has increased by about 60% since 1970. And this is the richness of that prairie grassland bird community. And if anyone needs a reminder, species richness is just simply the count of the number of species. There are more complicated ways you can measure diversity, and we did that, and the results are the same. So we just stick to the kind of simple metric here. So this, there's been a significant increase in grassland bird diversity in restored prairies. That is great news. That's not a given the kind of serious regional declines and all those external drivers that are happening. And what this data set allows us to do is look at the different factors that affect those birds. Me touching. There we go. One of the important factors for grassland bird community is the disturbance regimes. So the Park District manages Crow-Hassan with prescribed burns, and we're seeing here a temporal animation of which units were burned in which year. They try to do a mosaic and not burn the same unit too frequently. And what we found is that richness really does peak after 3 or 4 years. And that is exactly kind of the management regime that the park is trying to stick to, typically trying to burn a unit once every 3 years. So the monitoring that the Park District has done has confirmed that that's probably a pretty good management approach in this locality. Another factor that came out is really, really important is the time since a site was planted. So we have how many years it's been since a site was planted, and then the species richness, and there's a really strong increase in richness with time. So any newly restored sites, whether at Crow-Hassan or elsewhere in the region, are likely to have a really significant colonization credit. So if you've heard of extinction debt, which is kind of the concept that when you modify a habitat, you can have a delayed effect until the bird species respond and some of them will go extinct. There's kind of a flip side if you're restoring habitat. So this could be an effect of the grasslands maturing over time, or it could be reflective of just like species dispersal limitations. It takes time for birds to find these sites. And so we see this effect of years since the site was planted. So that was a really interesting result. And you can also fit this, the models included just the year, and time since restoration was much more important than just like a generic concept of year alone. So it really is something to do with like how individual sites change over time and not just like an overall change to the whole area over time. This is kind of preliminary, but here is the year since planted of each unit. Each unit gets its own line, and we see how richness tends to increase in each unit. And we have all the old restorations in red, and then the new restorations that were planted in 2014 in blue. And I noticed that those lines are much steeper. They seem to be gaining species at a faster rate. So this is probably explained by like a higher probability of dispersal from the nearby restored units into those new ones. There's more birds and greater pressure of colonizing birds into those new units now than there was when birds had to find the sites from much further away. It also could be related to changes and advances in how these restorations are carried out. But this is kind of preliminary, but it caught my eye and something we'll keep looking at. Biodiversity also needs space. The total area of prairie in the complex was really important for predicting richness in any given year. So as there's more and more total prairie, even accounting for the time, after accounting for how old the restoration is, there's still this effect of how much surrounding habitat there is. So this could be, you get additional area limited birds with bigger areas, or it could be something like a buffering effect. Like when you have a lot of habitat surrounding your focal area, there's a lot of individual birds that can recolonize like an individual site if there's a local disturbance or population is lost there. So at any given moment in time, you'd expect these sites to be empty for less amount of time and richness to be higher. Also areas related to like distance to edge, and that's been shown to be important in a lot of other prairies. So could be related to area as well. So that was the community level analysis at a really high level. I'm gonna start diving into some of those population level trends. And everything I'm showing here, I'm kind of comparing the trends in Crow-Hassan to the trends in our Minnesota Bird Conservation Region 23, which is like the prairie hardwood transition belt across the middle of the state. So we're looking at all the breeding bird survey routes that are done in that kind of belt and comparing them to Crow-Hassan. So for all these results, I'll sort of be plotting things on a graph that looks like this. We have the trend in the park restorations on the y-axis, and we have the regional trend on the x-axis. So if birds are up in this right quadrant, it means that they're increasing everywhere. Lower left, it means they're decreasing both in the parks and the region. And the really interesting zones are these ones in the corner where the kind of trends are diverging in the parks and the region. So we'd like to see lots of birds in this upper left because it means that parks are overperforming the region. And here's what the results look like with the bird codes. And I will walk through a bunch of these, but at first glance, it's really nice to see a lot of birds above this line, meaning that they have positive trends in the parks, and in this quadrant, meaning that they're kind of going the opposite direction of the region. They're going up, and in the region, these birds are going down. So just overall, there's 28 species that are on this chart that we had enough data to fit these models to. 19 species are increasing in the parks. That's almost 70% of the total bird community. And only 5 of those species are increasing regionally. So only 5 birds are also increasing in the larger region in addition to the parks. 86% of the species are declining regionally. So almost all the birds are to the left of that vertical line, meaning they're declining across the larger region of Minnesota, versus only 32% of birds are below the horizontal line, meaning they're declining in the parks. So we had a number of focal species going into this, meant to represent a diverse array of like grassland habitat types. And these are all species on the state's greatest conservation need list. So grasshopper sparrow, field sparrow, meadowlark, Henslow sparrow, sedge-wren, and bobolink. Every photo in this presentation was taken in Crow-Hassan Park. So some of you might see your images. Thank you. These came from eBird and the Macaulay Library. And so here are those focal species on this chart, and almost all of them are in that upper left quadrant. Bobolink is right on the margin there for whether the growth rate has been positive or negative in the parks over time. And when we plot each of those species here, we have the park trends on top, and you see most of these lines are going up over time from 1970 on the left to 2023 on the right. And in the larger Minnesota region from the breeding bird survey data, all of these species have significant declines over time. So this is really encouraging. I mean, I didn't think there'd be a ton of great news in a grassland bird presentation, but if we make this habitat, the birds are responding fairly well. Really encouraging. Up here also are some cavity nesters that are benefiting from targeted management. So we have tree swallow and eastern bluebird. Here's the eastern bluebird trends. Here's the park trend. Here's the regional trend. And then when you kind of plot them on the same plot as a percent change, we see that the regional trend has started to decline since about 2010, whereas the parks have continued to increase. So that is good news for bluebirds. Tree swallows are similar. You know, they reached sort of a peak in the mid-2000s and have been declining ever since across the broader region, but likely due to the management and installation of these nesting boxes for these cavity nesters, they have continued to climb in the parks and have not slowed down. Some of the declines in the park are associated with really clear local drivers. So brown-hatted cowbird, the park district made a really concerted effort beginning in the early 2000s to reduce artificial perches in Crowhaston Park. And right when that policy was instituted, we saw this pretty steep decline in brown-headed cowbirds. It also mirrors a decline regionally, so it's hard to say exactly if that's the only thing driving that decline in cowbirds. But anyway, when we saw that, we're like, okay, there's a pretty clear management action that is explaining that decline. Other declines are, a little less, probably less associated with local changes in the park. Here's Vesper sparrow, and what the take-home message here is that the park trend and the regional trend are like, mirror images or spitting images of each other. This could be, it could be an effect. Declines in the park could be because, Vesper sparrows need really like open, short vegetation and open ground, and maybe as the prairies have matured, there's been less of that over time, or there's been agricultural intensification and a loss of like hedgerows and shelter belts, and the birds we were seeing in the parks were kind of just coming from outside of it as a source population, and we don't have that source anymore. So this is an example of probably a regional trend swamping any local benefit of the grasslands at Crowhaston. Here's another way of looking at the data. We have the species trend as a percent change per year with the blue dots. So if you're to the right of this line, it means you're increasing. And we have the regional trends in the gray dots. And almost the take-home message is that almost every blue dot is to the right of the gray dot. So even when the species are declining in Crowhaston Park, they're declining less quickly than they are in the region overall. And I love looking at this grasshopper sparrow line. It's the second most rapidly declining species in the breeding bird atlas in the region, but it has a positive growth rate in the parks, which is pretty impressive. There's only 3 species that are doing better in the region, we think, than they're doing in the park. Let's see, mourning dove has the blue dot to the left, song sparrow, and northern cardinal. So none of those are exactly kind of, prairie obligate birds. Okay, so it's just some take-home messages. It's good news, basically. Diversity of grassland birds has increased in those restoration sites over the last 50 years. Very few prairie restorations have been monitored for so long, so this is a really unique and valuable data set, especially coming from like kind of a regional park district. The amount of time, the amount of area, and the level of management were all really important for the community level responses. At the population level, the regional trends are really dire, but the birds in the parks are really beating those trends. So they've managed to sustain populations of these grassland species for more than 50 years. And the species have responded to the kind of targeted management actions that have been happening in the parks. So I wanted to leave you with one closing thought. This is from a paper published in 2020. They looked at the kind of shift in where the prairie biome will be most suitable over time with climate change. So this is estimates in 2070 under different climate scenarios. And basically with more warming and change in precipitation, that prairie biome in Minnesota will be moving east and north. And they looked at all the protected areas in this zone and found that the amount of protected areas that will be suitable for prairies will increase up to 12.5 times the currently suitable amount. So they framed this as an opportunity for prairie birds in the state. And basically, by restoring those grasslands in western Hennepin County, Crow-Hassan is ready to receive kind of imperiled prairie species as their ranges shift north and east. And this might be something that either we choose to do in other protected areas in the region or is going to happen anyway with these climate changes. So this figure shows kind of the climate analog for the, so here's the region it's showing today, and its climate in 2065 will be most similar to what exists further south in Iowa and further west today. So this kind of biome and climate conditions will be moving into our region, along with probably a greater abundance of prairie bird species potentially. So that's just something to keep in mind as we hear more talks on prairie birds today. So thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions if there's time.
Check, check. There we go. If folks have questions, I've got a microphone. Dick King has a microphone. Raise your hand. We'll come around and find you, and we'll have time for a couple of questions.
I'm curious what happened to the bobolink population. It looks like it peaked significantly and then it had a major drop more recently. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't have, it does, that drop, I'm pretty sure is kind of reflected, it kind of coincides with this downturn in the region as well. This kind of sudden shift, there was kind of an increasing trend there in the early 2000s, and then a sharp turn. There's lots and lots of research into bobolinks. There seems to be this preference for alfalfa that has kind of developed over time, and there's probably strong drivers from wintering grounds that are affecting the trends we're seeing here. That's my best answer. I haven't dug super detailed into bobolinks specifically. But yeah, there was this period where they were doing pretty well, and that is not the case.
I wondered if you could tell us whether these management strategies are being applied then to other areas in the Three Rivers Park system?
Yes.
Question on your removal of artificial posting sites to get rid of cowbirds. How does that work?
What does that look like? What does that mean? Yeah, John and Stephen can speak up if I get it wrong, but I think it's basically a lot of like old fence posts and survey markers and old signage that doesn't have a sign anymore, that sort of thing, like human structures that were in the middle of the prairie and served as purchase for them.
And non-oak trees. So we used to have a lot of scattered elm and ash trees out in the middle of the prairies, and we cut those all down.
We were involved a number of years with the prairie enthusiasts, and of course they're initially involved mostly in forbs and grasses, and I think that the rest of the species would be very happy to hear this information. And I'm wondering how broadly we were involved in St. Croix County, western Wisconsin. I wonder how much this information is soaking into people who are engaged in prairie restoration as opposed to you folks in the park systems, sort of a general knowledge, because there's a real strong driver for interest. Birds, butterflies, and things like that. Grasses, yes. flowers, yes, but this is a really important piece of information.
Yeah, I think these case studies showing positive responses to the restorations that have happened are really valuable to kind of make that point that this work is important and can, lead to success despite the larger regional trends.
Have you looked at analyses on how intense of a fire increases population trends or your species richness, or when the fire is put on the landscape?
Yeah, no. The short answer is no. It's how long it's been since the unit was last burned. I don't know if John or Stephen want to add anything to that, but you could do that. There's, there are different times you can burn these sites. They typically are burned in the spring.
95% of the burns are done in April or early May, and 95% of the burns are 100% consumption of the grassland. So when we burn a unit, how big are they usually? They range from 10 acres to 50 acres per unit.
Thanks for your questions, everyone, and thank you, Sam.
Yeah.